Presentation today is about Stephania's song collection. About 5 or 6 years ago, I published an article about key themes in Ukrainian-Canadian ethnography for the Journal of Ukrainian Studies, and one of my research conclusions was the generation of Oleksiy Voropay Ohienko with his Ukrainskie dochristianskie вірування, and Stepan Kilemnik from the 50s and the 60s remain the most cited Ukrainian-Canadian ethnographies. That was a shock to me, and it was not pleasing to the reviewer, but the article got published anyways. These people mostly, they lived or published at least in Canada. They wrote quite big works and super Ukrainian-centered, and their kind of perspective on Ukrainian culture was that it is unique and special and deep, and they wanted to talk particularly about it as different than anything else. That's been on my mind for a long time. There have been some cracks in that kind of theoretical perspective when even Voropay, Ohienko, and Kilemnik recognize that, well, Poles also do Easter eggs, and something else is from ancient Greece. So Ukrainian culture is not entirely an island surrounded by brick walls, but it's kind of connected. One of the first serious studies done about Ukrainian-Canadian folklore studies was about immigration songs, where Volodymyr Hnatyuk in 1902 published some songs that clearly were Ukrainian traditional songs, but talked about immigration to Canada and also Brazil and the United States. So that model of the perfect island was a little bit broken right from the beginning, but that model was in many ways the ideal. In 1961, Robert Klimash defended his PhD on Ukrainian-Canadian culture, and he at first was looking for pure ancient Ukrainian folklore residing in Manitoba, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, but that's not what he found. He found really a lot of mixture, and he actually published almost entirely about hybridity after that kind of a study. So we shift from this idea of two islands to a kind of a continuum. Some things are really quite Ukrainian but a little bit Canadian, and some things are really Canadian but have a little bit of Ukrainian content in it. So it's messier, it's more of a continuum. And the plus signs are for everybody who published after Klimash, because really he changed the paradigm, and almost all Ukrainian-Canadian studies has been open towards hybridity, adaptation, the context influencing the content, and back and forth and things like that. And certainly this institution, the Keil Folklore Center, and the Department of Modern Languages and Cultural Studies, which had a MA and PhD in Ukrainian folklore for a couple of decades with some 50 graduate students writing a thesis, almost all of them were thinking more along lines of a continuum like that. Keeps jumping twice. This has come to the top of my mind again now since the war in Ukraine. On the one hand, we see many activists engaged in ethnography, folklore, ethnomusicology, fighting against Putin's claim that Ukraine is no different than Russia. So no, Ukraine is different. We do need to build a brick wall. We are indeed something like this. The colors are really cool, way different than on my screen, but that's okay. So on the one hand, we see a renewed, ferocious enthusiasm for arguing that Ukraine is unique. And let's say in this case, the red bubble is now Russia, or whatever. So there's kind of a real strong focus on that. On the other hand, in my mind, I think it's absolutely critical to show that Ukraine's culture and European culture are like this. Ukraine is part of Europe. Ukraine is engaged. So I want to do this one more and more ferociously. So that dichotomy between purity and independence and uniqueness versus melting in with your neighbors is, I think, in these last 6 or 7 months, hot again. And my mom passed away a year ago, and I was kind of among my brothers the one that played with archives the most, so her books and papers came to me, and I was supposed to go through them. She loved music. She was born on a farm outside of St. Denis, Saskatchewan, and she died in Saskatoon, and she lived in Saskatchewan her whole life, almost always in Saskatoon. She was really a musical person. She loved to sing, to perform. She was really quite active in the Ukrainian community. Saskatoon, like Edmonton, has about 10% people who would put a check mark beside Ukrainian in the Canadian census, for example. She was a mother. She had 6 sons and kind of didn't work outside the home after she was married. And really her identity really focused around that and her kids. And she was also a very devout person. She passed away, and I got a whole bunch of things. Some of them went in one direction, the books went in another direction, different books went in another direction, and what were left were a whole bunch of papirchiki, a whole bunch of little papers that were musical, performing in one way. I put them all together, and that's what I'd like to talk about, using that as an excuse to relate to that conceptual question that I introduced us with. I was also influenced by, I think, a really beautiful book by Diane Tai, a recently retired folklorist, a professor in Memorial University of Newfoundland. When her mom died, she took her mom's cooking recipes and wrote actually a monograph on them, and Baking as Biography, and the subtitle, A Life Story and Recipes. And that really touched me and felt really relevant. We both have the same kind of a project. After our parent dies, we take some little physical objects and infuse them with meaning if we can. We test to see if we can infuse them with meaning. So it's a kind of a forensic project, something that police detective does after a crime, let's say. In this case, it's not a crime. This is something done after something beautiful. So I don't have sound. I think there might be some recordings of my mom singing in a big tub of cassettes, but I haven't been able to go through them yet. But I do have physical objects, and I can observe the paper. I can see which pieces of paper have stains and have been used a lot, and which pieces of paper are pristine and probably haven't been picked up very much. I can look at the texts of the songs, and that's what I'll talk about mostly today, and a whole bunch of metatextual material, when those songs were composed, etc., whether my mom knew about the composition and the history of the song or not. But that history tells us a lot about her collection as well. So if the idea is to explore the world of song in Stephania's life, then I think we have to recognize that this collection is just a tiny fraction of it. She probably sang and heard sung hundreds of thousands of songs in her 87 years. A fraction of that, this is kind of a Venn diagram, a smaller fraction of that is, of those hundreds of thousands of songs, maybe, I don't know, 5,000 of them had some physical evidence, because a song otherwise is quite ephemeral. Of all of those thousands of songs that had physical evidence, a smaller subset of them, the physical evidence is still around. And then a smaller subset of that again are those songs that had traces that fell in those 5 folders and Ziploc bags and in between the pages of books that ended up collected by me, and I didn't give them away with the book or something. So I'm responsible a little bit for the content, but mostly my mom was responsible for the content. I do notice back here that all of the songs that are kept and curated and found in that collection are not identical. There's quite a variety within, and I want to talk about that variety within. I would, instead of dividing them historically or linguistically or by other factors, I'd like to kind of improvise to propose a concept called the spheres of the song. maybe I thought of other names, but spheres seem to be the most neutral and meaningless, which is what I'm looking for, because I want to give it meaning that comes from the songs themselves rather than mine and your precognition about what these words mean. So I'm not calling them paradigms or groupings or clusters or subcultures or categories or something like that. They're certainly spheres, and they certainly blend and overlap with each other. I hope that they're significant in identifying different parts of this collection, and they're not homogeneous, so some of them are mostly about the context, some of them are mostly about the subject matter of the text, some of them are mostly about her source, some of them are mostly about other factors, but I hope that they interrelate in a kind of a deep, meaningful way, and I'll argue a lot about that right away. I think the most important spheres, as I visualize them from my mother, are ones that might be called loosely folk songs. Other ones are national songs, popular songs, church songs, and heritage songs. I'm going to talk mostly about just the first three in the presentation. So the first sphere are folk songs. Folklore is defined in lots of different ways, and it jiggles about, and there's misunderstandings and different understandings about it. So I'm a little hesitant to use the word folk here, but what I'm really talking about is songs that have been transmitted orally, and that's the most important factor. So these are songs that came to my mom orally, and that's all. They're not mediated through some other thing other than somebody else singing. And that's an old definition for folklore, but for today, for our purposes, that's okay. They're characterized by a lot of different things. When you communicate something orally, the communication is not mechanical, so there is creative process during the communication. There is variability. In folk songs in general, you can't say this is the one official version. There is no real official, but there are many variants of it, because as another person sings it, they'll change a couple words, or one verse becomes irrelevant, and so they won't, or a new topic comes, so they'll add a verse. And all of those different variations of a song are just as legitimate as any other variation, because they are sung. And often the creator isn't unknown, because it's actually created by many different people as the song gets transmitted. And it's really community-based, so it's not about one particular author. That's not the focus anyways. Here's an example of one of those songs. It's a Christmas carol, maybe a Szczedriuka, but it feels like a Christmas carol in some ways. She recorded her dad singing. So in my childhood, I remember until I left Saskatoon, every Christmas, this was always on the old calendar, January 6th, we went to my grandparents' house because they also lived in Saskatoon. We had a traditional Christmas meal, and we sang carols for several hours. And after a while, we were singing, reading from the books, and it was confusing because people had different kantechka, these Christmas carol books. Then my kantechka has a different variation than yours, and we don't know which word to choose. And my Jidl couldn't read anyway, so for him it didn't really matter. After a while, my mom or her sisters would ask him to sing his songs, and he loved singing, and this is one of his songs. And somewhere later in his life, in his 90s, my mom decided to record it, and she transcribed it. So this is that particular song. There are 5 Christmas carols sung by her dad. It's a traditional one, published in 1914, is a huge collection of Ukrainian Christmas carols and New Year's carols, and it's a pretty good match with other carols that were collected in the same area within 50 kilometers of the village he was born. He probably learned the song in his village and came to Canada and still remembered it and sang it every Christmas into his 90s. It's 4 + 4 syllables, which are, according to the official scholarship, is typical for Szczedriuka. So Oi na richci na Jordani, that's 4 + 4 in every line. It keeps the traditional form. And in Nahachewsky's work, he identifies 28 variants of it that he collected by 1914, or he or other people collected. It still comes out a little bit, but the bold isn't as clear on the screen as it is here, but the words that are in bold are the ones that are identical to the closest variant in Nahachewsky's thing, published in 1914, and that my mom recorded, I'm guessing, around 1980 or something like that, in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. More than half of the words are identical to the other one, but half of them are a little bit, instead of going Anhelcheke, Ojčečeke, it would be Anhelcheke, Tajčečeke or something. There'd just be a small variant from time to time. That's what folk songs do. There are not very many folk songs in her collection. 25 on a good day. Some of them are so short I don't know whether to count them as an item or not. 5 from her dad, about 15 from a friend, Natalka, who just came from Ukraine recently. She was a recent immigrant and loved to sing. They worked at my dad's restaurant, and it was a Ukrainian restaurant, so they sold vareniki and holubtsi, and the ladies in the back made them by hand, and so they would spend 20 hours a week pinching pirohe and sometimes singing. So my mom recorded her or wrote out her words, and from some neighbors in a few other places. So she is in this history of those songs, she is the mediator. She is the first one to put them in a media other than oral transmission. The first one to put those particular variants in. The national songs sphere is much bigger in her collection. If we have 650 songs in that collection, not quite half of them I would call national songs. She sang in the parish choir, that's her over there. That's the ladies' choir in St. George's Parish in 1972. She has a variety of different national songs. God Save Our Gracious King. She has 2 versions of that one. She does not have God Save the Queen, so I know that she collected these, or these were published before 1952 when King George died, and she moved to Saskatoon off the farms in 1950. She went to high school in her first year in the city and did her grade 11, and so she must have got that in high school or still in her schools on the farm. 3 versions of O Canada, that kind of a thing. Those are examples of national songs. They're Saskatchewan, we love this place. The back side of that page is the Ukrainian text for the same song. But the vast majority of songs that fit into the national sphere are related to Ukrainian culture, and they're Ukrainian national songs. Here's one flyer that had about 30 different songs on it, and one of them is the song Oi Luzi Czerwona Kalena. You can't see because the TV is broken, but here is a little photograph of her when, maybe before she's married, she's wearing a Ukrainian costume. She did a Ukrainian dance on stage twice or 3 times in her life in 1952-53. You can't see it very well, but that's a Ukrainian national costume, meaning a costume from Poltava. She would never have had that on the farms. The blouse is actually her mother's blouse, so that one did come from the farms to the city, so from Europe to the farms in Saskatchewan to the city. But the rest of the costume was made as a costume that resembles kind of this person who is representing Ukrainian culture wearing the folk costume, which becomes a national costume of the central region of Ukraine, which is not where she comes from, but it's the national symbolic region of Ukraine. Song number 4, which is pretty dark here, is Oyu Luzi Czerwona Kalena. She had 2 versions of it. One of them was handwritten, so I know that's kind of significant in her life. I make a difference between ones that are just there published versus ones that were actively locally photocopied versus ones that she wrote out by hand. The ones that she wrote out by hand I interpret as more meaningful, more certainly meaningful to her. And if it just came from a publication, well, it might have been number 36, and maybe she sang it, maybe she didn't sing it. Some of the published ones she gathered in a collection that says, I don't know the melody for these ones. So those clearly weren't important in her life. but ones that she wrote out by hand were important in her life. She spent the time and energy and chose to write it out. Oi u Luzi Czerwona Kalena was a song from World War I, written by a guy called Stepan Chernetsky. It's been researched a whole bunch, especially recently. It revived and became really important around World War II, but throughout the whole 20th century it was popular and important in the repertoire of the Ukrainian national consciousness of communities literally all around the world. 3 days after the war started, Andriy sang it again. It worked every time until here. Okay. Sorry, I won't play that for you, but you've probably seen it. How many people have seen or any version of Oi u Luzi Czerwona Kalena? It's absolutely flooded the social media in many, many versions. Many of those versions, almost all of the ones recently recorded, the Lithuanians in Vilnius sang it in support of Ukraine, and Pink Floyd did a version of it, and it became really a popular meme. And he sang it in a weird modified melody and modified rhythm, and all of these ones supporting the war use his improvisation as if it's the standard text. So national songs, like nations, are supposed to be forever, they're supposed to be permanent, they apparently don't change, but in the real world they actually do change, and this one particularly did change its melody in the last 6 months. So Stephania came from the first wave of immigration to Canada. Her dad came in 1912. She was certainly born in Canada herself 15 or 20 years later. She was born in 1933. But when she moved to Saskatoon with her dad and her stepmother, but mostly she lived with her older sister in Saskatoon, she joined the urban Ukrainian Catholic parish of St. George's, and a group of post-World War II migrants settled in Saskatoon too. They didn't settle so much on the farms around Saskatchewan. There were thousands of Ukrainians rurally in Saskatchewan and thousands in Saskatoon itself. And the post-World War II immigrants were 100, 150. They were just a tiny proportion of the community, but super motivated, super active, and they basically took over the organizations or made their own organizations, and they became the leaders right away. They had a couple of years in the DP camps to practice being professional Ukrainian patriots, and when they moved to Saskatoon, boom, they had lots of energy. And they thought that the earlier generations, the earlier waves of Ukrainian Canadians were wimpy Ukrainians. They needed to pump up Ukrainian culture. So they organized theater groups, drama groups, revitalized the choir, took over many organizations, etc. When she moved to Saskatoon as a 17-year-old girl and joined the parish, she came into Saskatoon the same time they did, and she loved performing as a school kid, and she got swept into their movements. Two of the really important people were Anna Baran, who was very big into theater, very big into drama, and my mom liked theater and drama, so Pani Baran became her mentor in many different ways. My dad wasn't, my grandfather was not very literate. My first grandmother was literate and read Ukrainian newspapers to him, but she died when my mom was 8, and the stepmother didn't do that kind of stuff, so my mom didn't know how to read and write in Ukrainian. She kind of knew the alphabet a little bit, and mama, tato, just your basic kind of grade 1 words. But in Saskatoon in the early 50s, my mom learned to read and write Ukrainian by having to read the script of the play that she was performing in, or the choir had notes and the song was in Ukrainian. So my mom actively learned as in her 20s. And Pani Baran eventually started a kindergarten and Saturday school, and my mom became her teaching assistant, actually, especially when my mom had 4 kids in quick order, so she wanted her kids to learn that kind of stuff, and so she became the assistant because she had to get there anyways, and because she liked that kind of stuff. A good 60 songs are children's songs from the Saturday schools, from the kindergarten that she has. So that's 10% of the collection there. And another super important person was Father Volodymyr Ivashko. He was also a third wave immigrant. He was a Ukrainian Catholic priest and assigned in 1953 to the parish. Super, super important for her as the parish priest, deeply loved, and super important because one of his portfolios was youth, and he was a very dedicated, very active youth person. And the parish had a Gestetner machine that could print songs, and every year for the summer camp, Father Ivashko made a new songbook because every night at the camp, the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts sat around the bonfire and sang Ukrainian songs for as long as the kids wouldn't go crazy. And Father Ivashko really brought up a whole generation, me, of Canadian-born people who were engaged with Ukrainian culture, and these songs were national songs. Zirvalася hurtovina, topче збіжа на лану, виряджала мати свого сина, на кривавую війну. That's part of the first verse of it. I thought I wouldn't find a recording. I would sing it myself to highlight the idea that it's in my mom's collection, but my mom didn't sing that song. I sang that song way more often than she did at those Boy Scout camps, Girl Scout camps, Pike Lake, Saskatchewan especially. So it's my repertoire, but she inherited because she got Father Ivashko's songbooks year after year after year. The piece of paper is cut neatly and clean and no fingerprints on it and that kind of stuff. There are 2 copies of it because Father Ivashko reproduced and reproduced and reproduced. Another subset of this that maybe is a separate sphere or maybe belongs in the national sphere are the kind of semi-national songs. They were pop songs in Ukraine, but they became national songs in the diaspora because the only reason Ukrainians in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan ever heard those songs was because they were part of spreading and promoting Ukrainian culture. Here's one example that she wrote out by hand. It's Cheremshena. It's really quite a famous song. Many people know it and have heard it in Ukraine and in Canada. It was a big hit in its time. Written in Bukovina by Mykola Yurichuk in 1965. She wrote it by hand, so, the flag went up. That means that she really cared about it and things like that. But I noticed that the published versions of this song and her version of the song, the spelling of every word, the commas, the spacing in the line, are identical with the published versions. That means to me that it did not process through oral culture. She didn't write these songs out from memory. She wrote this song by copying it from another text. So this song was also not deeply part of her world, but she thought it was pretty. She took the time and energy to write it. It's really pixelated because the original is only this big. She fit it on just a little scrap of paper. I don't know why. Sphere number 3 is popular songs. Commercial songs was another way I thought I would call it. This is a photograph of a group of people, and she's in her photo album. She has about a dozen photographs of the youth group before she was married. She is on the edge, and she took scissors and cut off half of her own head on every single one. She did not want to be seen in a photograph with guys drinking beer. That's how she explained it to me. She was there, but she wasn't really there. No evidence. Because girls didn't do that. Good girls didn't do that. She liked pop music. She liked country and western music. It was youth culture at that time of various kinds. In her collection are 101 different English language popular songs, plus an additional 63 Christmas carols. So she had several published Christmas carol songs, all kinds of kind of English pop songs that were really promoted. So one came from Eaton's company because they wanted people to sing and celebrate and especially buy Christmas presents. 14 of the English songs are handwritten by her in a special notebook that's called Our Songs of the 50s and 60s, Dad and Mom. And the songs, I can look on the internet now, all the songs are there. Bill Crosby made one of them famous, Hank Williams, Guy Lombardo, the Weavers, Doris Day. That was her generation. When she was a teenager, these kind of songs were popular. Interesting for me, the handwritten ones are written, not copied. They're written from her memory because she doesn't spell the words the same way. She changes some of the words. Sometimes a verse is flipped around. Sometimes a word is missing or something like that. So these were songs that did go into her oral world. And because she wrote Dad and Mom, I can tell that it's really retrospective thinking. In her older years, she decided these songs are important to me. I want my kids to know that these songs were important to me. And I think that's really cool. I do remember when I was a kid, her record collection and Dad's record collection. My sister-in-law told me a story just a couple years ago. They were driving somewhere and on the radio came one particular song from this era, and my mom started crying because she explained that she just missed her husband, who died 20 years before. These songs were deeply, deeply connected to her emotional nerves and her memory bank and things. These were deep, deep, deep. And then when you talk about Elvis Presley, no! There is no Elvis Presley in her collection whatsoever. Rock and roll and that later stuff was not part of her world. So Elvis came out in '56, his first couple albums, I think. That's when she got married. That's when the boundary was drawn for what was beloved to her in terms of music. A special theme is this whole world of polka happiness. Polka happiness is a special term invented by this guy Charles Keil, who wrote a book about Polish-American English language polka music, which started in the 40s and with crazy Frank Yankovic is still alive and kicking today. A very particular thing, and his accent was on how it's really, really a hybrid phenomenon. Big centered in Chicago, but there's an enormous Polish community in that part of the United States. So I took this quote here from another person, Ann Gunkel, who also wrote about it. It's not Polish, and it's not American. It lives in the hyphen, which I think is a really nice message. And then it wasn't only Polish-American, but the Slovaks had it and Ukrainians had it too. And there's a big movement in the Ukrainian-Canadian world. Brian Chedevek wrote a brilliant PhD on it in 1999, Polkas on the Prairies. Mickey and Bunny are probably the most famous people that did that. My mom copied quite a few of Mickey and Bunny's songs into her notebooks. She had a souvenir which cost $1. In 1960, $1 for her and her boyfriend was money. So I could tell that he really liked her, I think. In any event, they had, I think it's 37 songs in this program where they gave the whole words so more people would sing and attend their concerts and things. The singers claim that they are the authors of the songs, but a good half of them are really clearly traditional songs that they've just printed out a particular variant and they maybe tweaked the words and added a verse or something like that. But at least half of them are traditional. About half of them have the Kolomeka structure with 8 syllables plus 6 syllables on each line. Really recognizable. There's been a debate about that kind of music since Theodor Fedik published, I think in 1912, the first version of what he called poems about Ukrainian immigration to Canada. And they're all just flooded with traditional verses as well. So is it individually authored literature or is it traditional folk? It's somewhere living in the hyphen of that as well. The texts in the Interlake Polka Kings music are in Ukrainian, but they use a lot of English words. And nearly half of them specifically mention Canada or something. So the setting for these stories that are told in the songs are really Canadian. It's new country rather than old country like the, let's say, the earlier generation. And 4 of the songs in the Interlake Polka King program are The Old Gray Mare, She Ain't What She Used to Be, translated into Ukrainian, or Little Brown Jug, which was a pretty popular folk song at the time, also translated Megalone Obuta, using very clearly Galician Ukrainian with a lot of Canadian content to it as well. One particular song that Mom wrote out by her hand was called Handzia, and it is, I think, a really fascinating one. It was sung and recorded by the D Drifters 5 in Winnipeg in the early 1960s, and it is using a melody that was made by Walt Solek in Chicago. He was one of the big leaders of the Polish-American polka happiness world, and maybe he had a Polish origin, but he wrote July the Polka in English. I play the D Drifters, maybe. Don't hold the waffles, hold the pizza. It's just on my speaker. If you listen to their, I'll show you the words right away, but if you listen to the way they sing, it's a very kind of a country and western thing to it. They have a little bit of twang in their voices, and when they sing in Ukrainian, they use English phonetics, so the consonants are not quite Ukrainian. If they are Ukrainian, they're Western Ukrainian. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Here's Walt Solek's things. I have a girlfriend, she is my honey. She only loves me when I have money. And on and on. And Handzia Luba is not exactly the same storyline, but it's the same kind of a thing. The girl picks the boy, isn't really faithful to the boy, and he really loves her, and he does all kinds of crazy things, and he works really hard, tries to get money because he's scared she'll leave him. So the idea is the same, but the theme is not. Then Mickey and Bunny, or maybe Mickey's dad, translated it again, because the D Drifters 5 played for them. And in the 60s, there's another one, and Mickey and Bunny's version is called July the Polka. So even closer reference to the Walt Solek's version. Then, and there are many songs like that, and those songs were really important to my mom, many of them written out by hand. The fourth sphere is church songs, but I'm going to just skip by them. She was super big and active in the parish there. Radical for at least the cathedral in Saskatoon. She became the cantor, the first woman that became a cantor. It was scandalous and shocking, but the men all died or lost their voices, and she could do it. So she did, and she was for like 15 years. On a daily basis, she went to church and she was the cantor. She knew the liturgical music really well. She knew all the changeable parts and all this kind of stuff, and really was a strong leader almost until the day she died. Really important for her. So she had quite a bit of books on that kind of stuff. They didn't make it into the collection because they went, she's got 2 sons that are priests and a grandson, and several daughter-in-laws and granddaughter-in-laws that are very active leaders in the church community. So those kind of pieces got kicked out of the collection, shall I say. That kind of music is really quite different. I won't play it for you because I want more time for conversation, if there will be some. I already said that. There were only 16 examples of really clearly church music. In all, there were about 2/3 Ukrainian, about 1/3 English. There were 40 some that were half English, half Ukrainian, and one that was in Latin. That was Ave Maria. She was a soloist one time in a concert or something, a famous arrangement of Ave Maria with the words in Latin that she sang and kept in her collection. That one was printed but was important to her. And the fifth point I would talk about, if I had more time or if there's a question about it, is her as heritage. This is not so much a specific repertoire, but certain songs really show an attitude of thinking, this is old, it's special, I better save it. Partly because she has a son who is a folklorist, but part of it was, and it's partly part of the national movement as well, to think that old is beautiful, which is a particular bias. Not everybody thinks about that. When we think about Macarena or some other song that we hear on the radio 20 years ago, we don't value Macarena because it's old and wow, actually it's brand new and really popular, and then it faded away and it's gone kind of. But there's heritage means old equals value added. She kept quite a few things. First of all, keeping them means that she had a bit of a heritage attitude. She on purpose recorded her father's carols because she thought nobody else knew these songs. Later on, she found one or two variants herself as well. Several of her collections say these are our songs, with "our" written in capital letters by her, not by me. A heavy representation of ritual songs, so she used to go to a Malanka workshop organized in the community, or a how do you sing Ukrainian wedding songs, things, and she kept all of those papers and put them in a special folder. Lots of times she called songs really old ones when they were from the 50s. So Handzia, which we saw was really newly invented after 1964, that was in her old song category. So it was a vernacular sense of oldness, old in her world, not necessarily chronologically from the origin of the song. So a couple of conclusions. I think that thinking of things as the song spheres is a useful way to conceptualize collections of music. More or less clear groups, some of the songs overlap in various ways, and some of them I put in one category, another one because of the context, or because of its origin, or because when she sang it, or where she got it from, etc. In at least this case, it messes up the hybridity between Ukrainian versus Canadian. And I want to elaborate on that at least a little bit. Remember my Venn diagram of it's a subset of a subset of a subset. For researchers, I think this is a really important thing to always remember. The different spheres are represented differentially in her collection. I would argue that folk songs are underrepresented. In her real life, she had access to a lot of songs that were orally transmitted. Even if it's Happy Birthday to You, that's orally transmitted for the most part. But it's not in her collection. Most of these songs didn't end up in her collection because she never bothered writing them down, because that's not what you do, you sing them. So they're underrepresented, which really biases the collection. National songs are overrepresented because her priest was pumping out copies and distributing, so she couldn't help but get them. And when you get the Ukrainian national anthem, you don't throw it in the garbage, you keep it. So the national sphere is overrepresented. Popular songs, in this case they were dear to her, but they're pretty special because they most clearly transcend the linguistic binary between Ukrainian versus English. Church songs are underrepresented, as I say, because they ended up in a different set of piles. So back to that original idea. The songs in the national sphere fit this model perhaps the most closely. But I would say there are cracks in the model too, and even the national sphere, she had 3 versions of O Canada. One of the versions was in Ukrainian. So that's a crack. That's even the national songs jumped a little bit back and forth. The Saskatchewan one was also in Ukrainian and in English when they were celebrating it. Intermediary are the religious songs. There's this kind of a sense that the Ukrainian churches are unique and special and separate, but really a lot of the music is at least pan-Byzantine or related to other Byzantine areas, and a lot of it is also quite international, the song, the Bible, for example, is not Ukrainian specific, etc., etc. So the religious sphere also has quite a bit of cracks in her collection and in general when people study that kind of music. The vernacular sphere is also not respecting barbed wire fences, but songs move across borders quite easily. So the vernacular sphere, I say, fits kind of here a little bit better. And the popular sphere messes up the Ukraine is unique, Canada is unique dichotomy. It's really a continuum of all kinds of possibilities. As a matter of fact, I think that's probably a better way to make a diagram of what's happening in the popular culture and partly in the vernacular culture. It's got just influences from all over the place. July the Polka, maybe originally Polish, then emigrated to the United States, then became popular there in a new context with new instruments, then made an English version of it, then went into the record industry, then was distributed by some guys in Canada, then was retranslated into a Slavic language into Ukrainian, then was popularized again. You have to look at it this kind of messy. Is it Ukrainian? Well, if you use the language, mostly. Is it English? Well, if you use the distribution, mostly. So you can't really have these kind of things for July the Polka. Or for that matter, for Shchana Narodu Ukraina, the national anthem of Ukraine, is based, at least influenced by, inspired a little bit. It was written by Pawlo Chrubinsky in the middle of the 1800s, but inspired by what's now the national anthem of Poland. So there's even cross-cultural things. So even on supranational things, there are cracks in the islands, cracks in the walls. And that's the point that Stephania's song collection kind of inspired me to talk about. Thank you.